Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Maginative Podcast. We're in Vegas for Google Cloud Next 2025. Some amazing announcements, and I have the pleasure of sitting down with Logan Kilpatrick. Logan has been on the Maginative Podcast before, I believe. Have you?
I don't know. I feel like we've talked too many times now. I don't actually remember if we did a podcast or not, but it's wonderful to be here and, to see you in person.
Yes, thank you. We're going to dive right in. I don't have a lot of time, but you had so many amazing announcements at Next this year. My favorite product was Firebase Studio, so I hope we get a chance to talk about that. But What about you? What is the big announcement that you want us to take away from Next 2025?
Yeah, I think the three really quick ones, tons of momentum for 2.5 Pro. So I think this was a sort of continuation of that momentum story with 2.5 Pro, which is awesome. And we rolled that out 2 weeks ago now. And then the other two is the next step of the story from a Veo perspective. Google launched sort of the early sort of prototypes of Veo, I think like late last year, if I remember correctly. And now, starting as of like literally today, Veo is available to all of our paid developers and the API. So like people can actually start building real products using what I think is the world's best video generation model, which is super cool. I think the third one is the live API. I think we released the initial version of this back in December, and this has been the follow-up of a bunch of the stuff that folks have been asking us for. How do you make the sessions have infinite context? How do you control the voice activation detection? How do you actually now support 30 languages, which is awesome. So the model, you can like converse with the model live, not in English only, which is super cool. So I'm really excited. I think there's a whole class of new applications now that this is like fully available for developers that don't exist right now, and it's going to be like a really interesting experience that like at the highest level, I actually think it makes AI feel much more accessible just because of like the way you're interacting with the model. So I'm really excited. I think there's a lot to build around that.
So let's unpack all of that, right? Let's start with the model side of the story. Gemini 2.5 Pro is amazing. It's absolutely crushing it on the boards. Do you guys expect that much uplift from it when you were thinking of it in training? How has that response been? I heard numbers through the keynote about adoption of Gemini models over the last year. That's amazing. Tell me about what you guys are seeing and how you're thinking about the 2.5 model series.
Yeah, I think the inflection point feels like the Gemini 2.0 moment, and then this 2.5 moment has felt like this amplification of all that momentum. So I think there was already like super strong momentum when we landed 2.0, actually literally just in general availability, like I think the second week of February or something like that. So it's been like only a couple of months, and like we're already like, this is incredible amount of growth that we're seeing. And I think now with 2.5 Pro, it is like the second part of the story. And I think we've historically been like really strong on being at the Pareto frontier of cost intelligence, that trade-off with flat. And I think now with 2.5 Pro, it's like we actually have the leading model from an intelligence perspective. And I think developers want both of these things. Like having a really low cost model is great, and it makes a lot of use cases work, but there's also use cases where the models just aren't smart enough yet. And I think the 2.5 Pro moment has been a lot of those use cases now becoming possible. And specifically, I think there's been a huge momentum around code stuff. So all of the IDEs and developer products adopting 2.5 Pro has been awesome to see. I'm spending all of my free time in those products building stuff and playing around with the model. So it's been super cool. And I think to the point of, did we expect this? I think it's one of those situations where there's all of this innovation happening, and it's like literally innovation. I was just having a conversation with one of the long context pre-training folks, but it's like innovation across long context, innovation across post-training, reasoning, Jack Ray, who I've had a bunch of conversations with. And it's actually hard to know what happens when you bring all those together. And it's also a great example of the like evals not tracking to like external reception and like how things actually get used which is why deploying models is so important. Because great, we see a bunch of numbers on a chart somewhere, but like that's not actually impactful. The thing that's impactful is you put a model in the hand of a developer or an end user, and they build something really cool, and they're like, I couldn't do this thing before, and now it works. So I think we've been incredibly excited about that reception. It's been super positive.
I've been impressed by the model personally. I've had a chance to play with it, and you had this moment when it got released and people were like, oh, it's 2.0 and now it's 2.5, and then they saw the difference. And
Yeah.
I think everybody was like, wow, this is a massive leap. So congrats on an amazing release. Let's zoom out a little bit and talk about your journey, because you mentioned talking to the developer community. How did you end up here? It's not a traditional role. I don't think many people in AI today started their careers thinking, oh, I'm going to go into AI. Talk a little bit about your journey, how you ended up here, and why Google?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been doing AI, ML, adjacent stuff for actually looking back now, like I connect the dots and I'm like, oh, I've always been doing machine learning. I started my career
You're one of the OGs.
Yeah, no. There's people who are doing it way longer than me, but I started my career at NASA doing like reinforcement learning stuff to help lunar rovers like find optimal traverses on the moon, which was super interesting, and spent like 3 years doing that. And then became a machine learning engineer and trained computer vision models and got to see that end of it. And then worked at a startup doing machine learning and deep learning for digital pathology and got to see what happens when you apply machine learning and deep learning to like specific problems, also computer vision stuff. And then did a stint doing developer relations and helping build language model stuff, and then joined Google. And I think there's a lot of consistency in the threads. There's a lot of things that are very different from what I was doing. Like I don't train models anymore. But it is also interesting that one of the threads that I think about a lot is like how, like where the value creation has been for me. I think if you look back to like machine learning 7 years ago, the value creation was actually in the model itself. Like there was not like a lot of product around the models. And interestingly, it feels like LLMs have been like a reiteration of this, which is like for the 2022 era, the 2023 era was like literally just people taking LLMs and putting them into the hands of people. And like, there was no product experience. Like you had to do all this stuff yourself.
I agree.
And I feel like we're just getting to the point now where there's a lot of product experiences where those things are being abstracted away. And for me, as someone who likes building products and likes building stuff, like that's incredible. Like it's a lot of fun to do that piece of it and think it's a hard problem, but it's a lot of fun to think about like how do you create a ton of value with AI while also in a lot of cases like trying to abstract the AI complexity away, because I think about this all the time. Like the vast majority of people don't care about AI. Like we care about AI because we're living in the world of AI stuff, but general public does not care. So I think you're limited on the value you can create for the world if you don't think about building products from that perspective. And I feel like that's the joy that I get in my job, is trying to walk that line of providing this infrastructure from a developer perspective, but also thinking about like how we can enable developers to build those products that like seamlessly blend the line between these two.
I would love for the audience to appreciate this. I remember when I first noticed you on Twitter, and you were speaking directly to people, responding to them, and they'd give feedback and you'd respond a few minutes later or a couple hours, but you'd always be following up. And I was like, this is different. It felt like you were taking feedback in real time and bringing it back to the team, and you saw the product change based on that feedback. Not many companies were investing the time and the effort to really listen to the community. How does Google think about community, and how do you think about interacting with the developer community?
Yeah, I have two angles to answer this. I think the first one is like, I'm grateful to the Google. I think there's a inherent amount of risk in like letting people do that. Just like from a comms perspective, from like engaging perspective, like I fundamentally can like see the challenge, and like I live those challenges as someone who's trying to do this work all the time. But I think the team at Google has been incredibly like helpful in enabling me to do that, which I'm super grateful for, because ultimately like the second thread of this is, I think this is like the way I'm able to do my job most effectively. I think if I couldn't go and talk to developers and I couldn't have that level of engagement, I think it'd just be hard to build a product. And ultimately, the ecosystem is so willing to give us feedback. I'm like, it honestly makes my job easy, because I get to go on Twitter, tell people about all the cool things that we're doing, and they say, hey, this thing sucks, or go make this thing better. I'm like, awesome, like great. It's very easy to hill climb on making a better product. It would be much harder if no one cared and they weren't giving us the level of feedback. So I'm super grateful that folks are interested, and very selfishly, it genuinely does make it easy for me to help build a great product when we get that feedback.
But it makes a difference to the community also, because when I talk to companies, when I talk to CTOs, when I talk to developers, I bring up your name. They sometimes have interacted with you, but when the models are released, they look forward to the commentary that you provide, because you are using it just like them. You're providing examples and use cases. And I think that sort of energy isn't something we have seen in the developer community in a long time. And it's really great to see that today.
Yeah, it is this interesting situation, which is, to be candid, like I don't think about how I'm creating community. I think it like comes very naturally, and I think like I am a very small node of this much larger ecosystem, and like trying to help give whatever amount of perspective that I can.
Yeah.
And really like the space is so large and there's so many people playing that like I'm happy that people look positively at this work, but it really does feel like me just doing right by developers and getting the information I would want as a developer. I think it just makes it feels very naturally.
Yeah, I think it's about them feeling like they have a voice and somebody listening, and I think that's good. All right, you mentioned Veo, and what I love about Veo is, of course, you've had great media generating models before, but nothing that is accessible through an API that you could enable companies to go out and build products with this technology. How are you thinking about the opportunity with media generation models? Is this just for creative use cases, or are you seeing other use cases for these models?
Yeah, that's a good question. I still think like today it feels like we're early in this like generative media space. I think it is probably a mostly creative use cases today. I think there's a lot of stuff where the general trend across AI is this like horizontal up-leveling of capabilities. We're seeing this with coding right now. We've seen this historically with like image generation models. I think video generation models is going to be this next thing where I'm not capable of doing anything creative. Like by default, I can't. I can get into insert your favorite video editing software and do a horrible job. But it is really cool to see explicitly like actually image to videos is one of the things that rolled out with this iteration of Veo. And I think there's so many cool use cases where it actually just, it's like a totally new addressable market that didn't exist before. The average person was not like, let me go find a Hollywood VFX crew to go into, they were just not doing it. Whatever their idea was, like it didn't exist, they weren't going to do it.
Yeah.
So I think there's these, that piece gets me excited where like it's not just this old thing gets replaced by this new thing. It's like actually this entirely new segment of the market created because anyone can now put in an image of something and have an incredibly visual video story generated for them.
Yeah.
So I've been super excited. It'll be interesting to see like what developer adoption actually looks like, because there are other powerful models out there, but I think Veo has there's a lot of nuance to what makes Veo feel so good as a model to work with.
Yeah, I was talking to Paige Bailey yesterday, and one of the things she mentioned is a lot of use cases sometimes aren't from obvious places. So getting this in the hands of everyday users, in the hands of developers, and just watching what the community creates always opens up so many new doors. The last new product I want to touch on is Firebase Studio.
Yeah.
Listen, this is amazing. Like I turn it on. As soon as I get home this weekend, I'm going to be in Firebase Studio because I love just the deep integration with Firebase and just how seamless everything works. Talk to me a little bit about Firebase Studio, and while you're at it, talk to me about Google's overall ecosystem. So now we have Firebase Studio, we have Google AI Studio, we have Vertex AI, we have Colabs. Talk to me about how everything integrates and how developers and companies should be thinking about the offerings.
Yeah, I think the Firebase Studio story is incredible. I think for folks who weren't following, Google released Project IDX last year at I/O, which was a browser-based general purpose IDE created by the same organization that was working on Firebase. It wasn't branded as Firebase at that time. And I think as they've seen some of this new emergent product trends around like text to code and all the like assets to like application development, I think Firebase is like really uniquely positioned as like I think about Firebase as the sort of batteries included way to go and build developer products where like they have a database, they have everything works on mobile, they have authentication, they take care of everything for you. So it makes a ton of sense. Like you have all the parts there. How can we use AI to bootstrap developing applications? And I think Firebase has, again, for folks who aren't familiar with Firebase, a super storied like perspective in the developer ecosystem. Like, I think
it was the rage. I used Firebase when we were building a lot of apps. Like it was just plug and play.
Yeah.
Like I thought it was an amazing product.
Yeah, developers love Firebase. I think there's few teams at Google that are as well positioned to build like a really great developer product. And I think we're seeing that in the positive reception of Firebase Studio. And again, it's this, selfishly for me, I think it's the story of the Gemini models enabling that product experience to really come to life, which is super, super cool. So I'm excited for folks to build more with it.
So then you have Firebase Studio, and I'm assuming that's going to cater towards maybe lower code developers that are trying to just abstract away the technical complexity of dealing with databases and backends. But talk to me about AI Studio. Where does that fit in? And you can go into AI Studio today, for example, you can try the models, you can even fine tune a model. but you can't do like evals. You can't run evals, as far as I know. You can correct me, but you can do that in Vertex AI, right?
Yeah.
And so Google has all of these different tools. Can you walk me through the ecosystem? And if I'm a developer out there listening, how should they be thinking about which tools to use and when?
Yeah, I think the broad strategy from a developer perspective for Google is like meeting developers where they are, wherever they are. And I think you see this across, you didn't even mention something like we have Kaggle, we have all these other things. There's lots of different places where Google is meeting developers. And I think a lot of this is you want to meet developers like on their turf, like in the space that they're building. I think Firebase is a good example of this. Like Firebase is meeting historically the like mobile developers segment, I think was like part of their core market. For us with AI Studio, where we're trying to meet developers is you just want a simple API in order to access language models, and specifically like Google's most advanced language models or video language models or image language models, however you want to frame it, with Veo, Imagine, and Gemini, and abstract away all the other complexity from it. We know you have other problems to solve. We know that you have other problems. Like, we're not trying to help you solve those problems. We're trying to help you solve your AI problems and make that as seamless and as easy as possible. I think things like evals are actually a great example. We should build that. That's a really important problem that developers have. We've thought a lot about it. There's work happening to enable that. On the Vertex side, we're trying to meet developers where they're at. I think Vertex is also trying to do that to a certain extent, but they're also trying to solve this problem like through the lens of like very bespoke enterprise needs. So if you're someone you care about regional data compliance, you care about all the nuance and challenges of security, and you're a large Fortune 500 company, like all those things the Vertex team has built a lot of custom infrastructure to make it so that those customers can be successful. And the ideal success case is like you start on AI Studio, you get product market fit, you're super happy, and like you graduate into Vertex and you get all the other stuff that Google has to offer from a cloud perspective. And from an infrastructure perspective, that's actually how AI Studio is built. So behind the scenes, you're actually a cloud customer when you're using AI Studio, you're using the cloud APIs, you're using cloud billing, you're tied into the ecosystem. And we're thinking about even more ways of like bringing the other awesome parts of Google to developers in the really abstracted away way through AI Studio. So I'm excited. We'll have more to share.
Good. I love even the quality of life updates. Like you made the design, the UI changes recently, and I was like, wow, it's getting polished. I love it.
It's getting even better. Amar on our team and our whole design team have been absolutely crushing it with some of the new designs. I'm excited. And I think the design piece is super important to signal like the product that we're trying to build, which is a product for developers. I think we're also like AI super fans find their way into, or AI enthusiasts find their way into AI Studio all the time, but like really we're trying to build a product to enable developers to be successful. And I think hopefully like over time we'll solidify this from a product positioning standpoint.
And that's something that I also wanted to clarify, because you do have a lot of enthusiasts that are looking for a solution, probably more no code or low code. AI Studio is still a product that you're saying is primarily for developers meeting developer needs, correct?
Yeah, I think there's two angles to this. One is who can we make successful today with the product that we have? It's developers. Like I think you need to be a developer to be successful with ultimately the API, which is what you go and build something with. I think longer term time horizon, I think our team's thought a lot about who is our audience, and I think like internally we've reframed this as like we're building for AI builders explicitly to account for the idea that there'll be more traditional developers, but there'll also be more people who look like traditional developers who aren't writing every line of code. Yeah. And we want those people to be successful. Like those people are going to need APIs for AI as well, and we want to make sure to have solutions to support them. I think it's more of a long-term perspective versus like the point in time. The point in time today, we're still building a developer product. I think in the next 3 years, it's going to look different from that sense as the ecosystem continues to change.
One last thing about evals. Earlier you mentioned like all these evals. I'm sure you're looking at evals internally. A lot of the community is obsessed with evals. You have the academic benchmarks, the research benchmarks. Then you have the human LM-SIS and Hugging Face leaderboards. How does Google think about evals internally? When you release a model like 2.5, how are you thinking about the benchmarks that you're looking to hit? And do you ever get surprised in terms of maybe what it says on the benchmarks, like you said, and just how people respond to it?
Yeah, I think that is the subtext of the broader eval story is evals tell a sliver of the story. Like actually like real world usage looks very different in a lot of cases than evals, and like evals at their best are a twofold. One is like a mechanism for researchers to like actually know what the North Star is. And I think like you need eval so that like you have a way of saying what does success look like if we keep trying to do all these different techniques. But separately, you also want evals to be like representative of what people are trying to do with the models.
Yeah,
And I think that's actually where a lot of the tension is. If you look historically at like lots of academic evals or other types of evals, it's like you squint your eyes and like, is this actually how people use the models? In a lot of cases, no, but it doesn't mean that what those things are measuring aren't important. I think that's really the challenge, is trying to find that balance of evals that measure what people actually care about who are using the models, evals that are actually easy to, the challenging thing is the way that people use models is actually oftentimes difficult to approximate in an eval, because it's a really complex workflow, requires a lot of data that doesn't exist in an easy to access way. So I think there's lots of dimensions to the eval story, which makes it super complex. And actually, I think a good example of this was 2.0 Pro, which was like a sort of blip now because everyone is excited about 2.5 Pro, but 2.0 Pro, which was the predecessor to, or the sort of follow-on model from the Gemini 1206 experimental model, which was the precursor to 2.0 Pro, was this example where we released a bunch of evals and people were like, oh, I'm not that impressed. And then we started to actually get a bunch of feedback from developers being like, wait, this actually is a much better model than we've ever got from Google before. So it is this weird situation where oftentimes the evals don't tell the full story, and you really need to use the models. And I think as you have more complex use cases, actually, the evals become like a little bit more noisy of an approximation of like how strong the models really are. And I think this is getting more challenging because reasoning exacerbates that trend a little bit.
Yeah, I remember 2.0 Flash, and that was an amazing model. And
This was 2 months ago. You're like, I remember like it was some off in the distant thing, and it was like the model just went generally available 2 months ago.
2 months in AI years is like a decade at this point in time.
That's how I feel.
It's funny, we go into companies and we're doing training, and at the beginning of the week, I'll say to them in the State of the Union, I'll say, I'll share news today and I'll share updates that by the end of the week, it'll be obsolete.
Yeah.
And it's always impressive. Like clockwork on Friday, we look back and I'm like, yep, there's a new model here. This is no longer the state of the art. You're seeing that, and it's a lot for companies to absorb. It's a lot for an enterprise to be planning for. How should executives, how should leaders be thinking about the pace of change today and staying up to speed with what's happening, but also building products on something that's just changing so quickly?
Yeah, I think this is actually one of the toughest parts about AI right now, and I think about this all the time as someone who doesn't have enough time to do all the things that I want to be able to do. Two dimensions to this. One, I think the progress is actually continuing to accelerate, which is interesting. I think there was like a moment where everyone last year was like,
oh, wall
is here. Which is so funny. I'm like, I would love to find out. We need a good documentary on like where that narrative came from. But like, it's obviously, it certainly hasn't tracked reality of all the progress that's happened in the last 6 months. So I think that like, you should bet on the fact that the progress is going to continue, and it's going to continue faster. Like the amount of talent, capital, compute, new ideas, products to be built happening in this space right now is like breathtaking how much is happening. The interesting point around this though is that it does feel like as the frontier, there's this push and pull between the frontier. So like the frontier continues, and along the frontier continuing is like all of these like drops of opportunity along the way. And it's like each of those fixed points of opportunity is like many companies to be built, many new things to explore, like many interesting products that could exist, which are actually like in some sense disconnected from the frontier. I have this conversation with founders all the time where folks are like, yeah, we care about the frontier models and it's awesome and it's helpful to us, but we found the thing that we think is like a really great business to build, and like we don't need to keep trying to reinvent the wheel. Like I think there's like all these, another way of putting it is there's all these like product market fit opportunities as the models keep getting better.
Yeah.
And I think if you find one of those opportunities, go and build a great business. Like I think at the end of the day, it takes a while to build also just like a good product, and I think that's the challenge that a lot of people have right now, which is like the frontier is pulling you along, and in some sense it's pulling you away from building like a really deep, thoughtful product. And I think if you make it along that curve somewhere and you find something that you think is working, try to build that great product, because it's the more you can abstract away AI, the more I think folks will, in the long term, enjoy using that product.
I love that. Let's switch gears and talk about open source, open weight models. Obviously, Google has invested a lot with the Gemma series of models, an amazing model family. I love the fine-tuned versions, text Gemma. If you haven't had a chance to check out the Gemma models, I highly encourage you to do that. I'd love to hear how Google is thinking about the open source community, how you balance that between the proprietary models, and how you think the developer community or even just a company should be thinking about open source versus the proprietary models.
Yeah, there's a lot of angles to this. I think I have a philosophical take on open source, which is I think it's incredibly important for the world and the ecosystem, et cetera, et cetera. But I think there's also just so much practicality in the open source story, which is around like, at the end of the day, there's lots of companies and there's lots of use cases where they can't, for regulatory reasons, for compliance reasons, like they need a model that's just going to be the same and that can be inspected and interpreted, and they know, okay, I can build this thing sitting in a hospital system somewhere and it's not going to change, nothing's going to happen, I can rely on that. So I think from a practical perspective, you need open source because there's just use cases which require it, and they're like important business product use cases that require it. I think the other angle of this is like, how does Google show up for the ecosystem? And I think there's this expectation of, because of historically the work that Google's done in the open source ecosystem, but also just again through this lens of the Gemma story, to me is like a story of us meeting developers where they're at. You can get the open source Gemma models in whatever product they're on Hugging Face, they're on Kaggle, they're in all these other places. So there's like the stories of how developers come to us for some of our like proprietary models, and we're also going to where developers are to like bring them these open models, which I think is like this really helpful, healthy balance between these two things. And then this goes back to, what problem are you trying to solve? I think there's a lot of use cases today where like the edge and the differentiator is, I need to be on the frontier of capabilities, and that necessitates in a lot of cases being on the latest proprietary models. I think there's also use cases where like you can build a really differentiated experience, either from a cost perspective or from like a hardware perspective, using Gemma, because I think one of the like core missions for Gemma is trying to have the best in class performance across like all the different like classes of hardware. So from a mobile to a single GPU to like a little bit larger of a GPU cluster, how do you get like the best cost performance intelligence trade-off, which is really interesting. And I'm excited for, there's just so much stuff where developers are economically disincentivized from building AI into their products. And I think one of the enablers of the antidote to that is open models in some case. And if you have strong enough open models that can run on device, like you can end up just like with a lot more AI than it would be feasible to for a free product or a product that's $20 a month or whatever it is. There's just not enough intelligence that you can buy at that cost level.
Okay. I'm not convinced, and I'll tell you why. So you have open source models, you have open weight models. Today you have Gemma, you have Llama 3, you have Pi from Microsoft, you have OpenAI saying that they're going to release open models. But the problem is that unlike traditional open source, where you had like the central repository that everyone was contributing to, the open models today, you don't really get that uplift from all the community contributing back and everybody rising. Is it a missed opportunity for the industry not to have something like a Linux Foundation where they're putting resources behind an open source initiative that can move the state of the art for model development or model research forward? Or is it just going to be the state of affairs where you'll have different companies showcasing their own models, sometimes with their own licensing? How do you feel about that as a developer, and what have you heard from the community?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think as someone who spent a lot of time in open source, I think there's a classic framing of this, which like actually openness is this like really broad spectrum, and like what people say at the top level, open source, and what do they actually mean by open source? And like do you have open governance? Do you have, how do you make decisions about all these other things? So there's so much complexity and dimensions to it. I think like open weight models are like one dimension of this like openness spectrum, but that's certainly on the spectrum. You could have open data, open infrastructure to reproduce the models, et cetera, but I think this goes back to what is the problem that you're actually trying to solve. I think somebody probably will do the like fully, you have open data, you have open governance, you have just a way to make the models easily trainable and reproduce, all those things, which I think is important. But I think
the Allen Institute is
doing a lot of that work, which is awesome. I wouldn't discount though just like how important it is to be able to put models into the hands of the world. I think even if you can't go the full sort of one end of the spectrum or the other, I think there's a lot of value to be created in like all of these derivative models. I think like folks you learn a lot of stuff by like fine tuning these models, inspecting them. So I think I'm happy that we're putting those models into the hands of the world for folks to figure out all the different things that they can do with them. And also because at the end of the day, as someone who loves building products, there's interesting products that you can build that wouldn't be possible without these types of models. And we're really focused on, again, that angle of having the most performant model for these hardware classes. And like the small 1B models are super important because there's just a lot of stuff that you can build that wouldn't be possible otherwise. And Gemma gets to benefit from all the Gemini innovation, which I think is the other cool thing. Like it's literally the same, you can like almost linearly track this where it's like the Gemini models have long context. Okay, now Gemma has 128K context, which is awesome. The Gemini models are natively multimodal. Okay, now the Gemma models have multimodal. So like there is this like great flow of research innovation from Gemini to Gemma, which I think I'm hopeful will continue to happen, and I think has been super beneficial for the ecosystem.
Yeah, and it's something I think the community is grateful for. The fact that Google is still pushing the frontier, but they're at least contributing open source models back to the community. I think it has helped a lot. You have thousands of models now on Hugging Face that people will just tweak and fine tune and then quantize. And it's an amazing experience just watching how community has come up around the models. So let's wrap up. Let's put some stakes in the ground. Let's talk about the future. A lot of leaders at prominent research labs have come out with timelines as to when they think coding will be replaced by AI. What are your thoughts on that? And are you willing to commit to a year?
Yeah, my framing of this is that coding won't be replaced by AI. I think developers wielding these tools are going, I really do just like fundamentally believe in a lot of these AI tools as being, at the end of the day, tools wielded by people. And I think developers wielding like code generating tools is like actually no different than what happens. Like developers are wielding code generating tools right now, and like developers haven't been replaced. If the models can write more code, great. Developers will be wielding a more powerful tool. Just as you look at every other layer of innovation that's happened, a developer didn't have to write every level of assembly code. All of a sudden they had higher level programming languages, and like developers benefit from open source because there's all, so I think this trend is actually extremely similar to what's happened in the past, and like what it means to be a developer might ebb and flow slightly, but I think the fundamental premise is going to be the same, and ultimately there will still be cases where you have to peek under the hood, you have to go in and tweak something, and it's going to be developers who are doing that work.
Okay, I love that response. Agree with that sentiment. I think having developers have access to more powerful tools means they can solve bigger problems and build more complex products and services.
Yeah, and there's this beautiful near infinite demand for software. Like, I think the world is rate limited by how much software exists and like actually the cost and the barrier of creating software. So I think we have not seen anywhere near the amount of value to be created by traditional software developers yet, which again is super exciting.
What are you most excited about when you look at the long-term horizon, let's say 5 to 10 years? What excites you the most about where AI could go? Are you interested in physical AI? Are you interested in just like the Jarvis AI, all AI? What gets you excited about going to work every day to keep on pushing the frontier of what we're building?
Yeah, that's another good question. I do think there's this interesting realization or thought that I have all the time, which is AI has become, and just like technology in general, is so good at moving bits around on the internet, but like actually doing anything with atoms is really difficult. And that analogy breaks down because everything's atoms, but the like physical atoms, not computer bits moving around. And the timeline for like physical change in the world is just like much longer than it is to like, my best example of this is we could have AGI today, and what does that actually mean? It doesn't really matter because like you would still look outside and see the world, and like the buildings are going to look the same, the sidewalk that I'm walking on is the same, the restaurant I'm going to is going to look the same. Yeah, maybe some stuff is a little bit better, faster, and easier, but really moving atoms around is so difficult. So I am super excited for this new wave of like material science companies and chemistry and physics and all the innovation that needs to happen across those domains for AI to solve the like very like human level problems of like how do I make housing cheaper and more affordable and easier to build, like how do I solve all those, how do I make better infrastructure for humans and cars and trains and all. There's so many interesting problems which like yeah, I think we need to solve, and I'm hopeful that as we keep making this technology better, we'll be able to solve those.
Oh, what a note to end on. Logan, thank you.
Yeah,
it's
this was
always
a ton
a
of fun.
pleasure talking to you. I'll see you at Google I/O. I know you have big
excited.
announcements, so I'm looking forward to that also.
Yeah, it's going to be a ton of fun. Then hopefully Jamaica after that.
Definitely Jamaica. You heard it here first. Jamaica is happening. All right, thank you everyone for joining us. And Logan, again, appreciate the time.
Yeah, thank you.